My name is Jessica, I am 34 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I was debriefing high-ranking officials at the Pentagon on asymmetrical warfare in the Middle East. Today I am standing in a kitchen in Shaker Heights, Ohio, being treated like a vagrant by my own blood. Move your duffel bag, Jess. It is blocking the view of the $4,500 Calicut Borghini Marble Island, my sister Victoria sneered, her voice dripping with a condescension that was sharper than the scent of the 2018 Silver Oak Cabernet she was swirling in a Riedel crystal glass. I looked down at my weathered Coyote tan Filson duffel, the fabric stained with the dust of the Helmand province and the grease of 1,000 Chinook transport flights, and then back at Victoria. She was draped in a cream-colored Loro Piana cashmere wrap that probably cost more than the monthly combat pay of the soldiers I led through IED-laden valleys in Bakwa. To her, I am just a broke grunt, a woman who wasted her youth playing soldier while she married into a real estate empire and perfected the art of the charity gala. She has no idea that the tactical watch on my wrist, a scratched Garmin Tactics Delta, has tracked heart rates in kill zones while she was tracking the delivery of her Hermes Birkin. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of expensive truffle oil and the suffocating weight of family expectations. My brother Samuel, a 42-year-old neurosurgeon at the Cleveland Clinic, sat across the island, his fingers, hands that were insured for 7 figures, tapping rhythmically on the polished stone. He looked at me with a localized pity, the kind of look he probably gives to terminal patients he knows he cannot save. He was wearing a Tag Heuer Carrera that caught the recessed LED lighting of the kitchen, and he cleared his throat with the practiced authority of a man used to being the smartest person in the room. Jessica, we really need to discuss your transition back to civilian life, Samuel said, his voice modulated to that soothing, surgical calm. We have been looking at some administrative roles at the hospital. It would be a steady salary, maybe $65,000 a year to start, and you would finally have a stable 401k instead of whatever pittance the government provides. He did not mention that my current GS-15 salary and tactical bonuses outpaced his entry-level administrative offer, or that I had spent the last decade managing multi-million-dollar assets and human lives under the most extreme pressure imaginable. To them, I was a charity case, a broken vet who needed to be handled with soft gloves and hidden away from the neighbors so as not to embarrass the family brand. I felt the familiar heat of a slow-burn anger rising in my chest, the kind of cold, calculated fury that used to keep me sharp during 48-hour surveillance ops. I adjusted the collar of my olive drab utility shirt, my fingers brushing against the faint scar near my collarbone, a souvenir from a shrapnel spray in 2019. I am a senior tactical analyst and a Bronze Star recipient, a woman who has forgotten more about logistics and high-stakes diplomacy than Victoria will ever know about interior design. Yet here I was, surrounded by the opulence of a $4.2 million colonial estate, feeling like a stranger in a land of porcelain and pretense. The hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator was the only sound for a moment as I picked up my bag. The weight of it felt honest compared to the shallow vanity of this room. I looked at the marble island, then at Victoria's perfectly manicured nails, and finally at Samuel's expensive, unseeing eyes. They saw a soldier who had lost her way, but they failed to realize that the person standing in their kitchen was the only one in the room who truly understood the cost of the freedom they used to belittle her. My silence was not submission, it was reconnaissance. I was merely mapping the terrain of a different kind of battlefield, one where the enemies wore Italian silk and the casualties were measured in dignity rather than blood. The contrast in that kitchen was more than just aesthetic. It was a suffocating physical weight that pressed against my lungs, making the air-conditioned atmosphere of the Shaker Heights estate feel thinner than the oxygen at 10,000 feet in the Hindu Kush. Victoria adjusted the sleeve of her $1,200 Loro Piana baby cashmere sweater, the fabric a shade of cream so delicate it seemed designed specifically to mock the rugged, functional world I inhabited. She leaned against the marble, her posture calculated to project the image of a woman who had just overseen a record-breaking $2.4 million quarter at her boutique public relations firm. She spoke in rapid-fire sentences about conversion rates, high-net-worth acquisitions, and the sheer exhaustion of managing a staff of 20-somethings who didn't understand the grit required for real success. As she spoke, her eyes drifted downward, tracing the silhouette of my $40 Target Denizen jeans and the scuffed, salt-stained leather of my tactical boots, which had walked through the mud of Bagram and the gravel of the Pentagon parking lot alike. The look on her face was one of visible, visceral disgust, the kind of expression one might reserve for a smudge of grease on a white silk sofa or a stray weed in a perfectly manicured English garden. Samuel sat beside her, seemingly oblivious to the tension but participating in the silent execution of my dignity nonetheless as he fiddled with the slide rule bezel of his $15,000 Breitling Navitimer B01. He wasn't even using the chronograph. He was just spinning the crown, the mechanical clicks punctuating Victoria's monologue like a metronome of inherited wealth. He checked the time with a flourish of his wrist, a gesture meant to remind everyone that a neurosurgeon's minutes were billed at a rate I couldn't possibly comprehend. To them, my life was a series of unfortunate choices that led to a mediocre paycheck and a closet full of olive drab. They had spent the better part of 2 decades systematically erasing my service from the family narrative, treating my Bronze Star for valor like a dusty participation trophy from a middle school track meet that was better left in a box in the attic. They spoke about their own accolades with a reverence that bordered on the religious, celebrating every elite lawyer award or top doctor certificate that Victoria had likely written the press releases for herself. It was a curated reality where the only things that mattered were the things you could buy, display, or use to intimidate the neighbors at the country club. I watched Victoria's mouth move, her words blurring into a background hum of self-congratulation, and I thought about the men I had served with who would never see a kitchen this nice or a sweater that expensive. I thought about the 24-hour shifts in the windowless basements of the Pentagon, where the decisions I made influenced global security parameters, while my sister was busy deciding which shade of taupe would best suit a lobby in downtown Cleveland. The injustice of it didn't just hurt, it burned with a cold, steady flame. They looked at my boots and saw a lack of ambition, failing to realize that those boots had stood on ground that would make their knees buckle in seconds. They saw a broke grunt because I didn't wear my net worth on my sleeve or brag about quarterly earnings in a world where the only real currency was the lives you saved or the secrets you kept. Every time Samuel adjusted that heavy gold watch or Victoria smoothed her designer knitwear, they were building a wall between us, brick by expensive brick, ensuring that the girl who went to war would never truly be welcome in the home she had fought to protect. I stood there, a ghost in a house of mirrors, realized that in their eyes, my sacrifice was nothing more than a social inconvenience, a blemish on the polished surface of their carefully constructed high-priced lives. The betrayal did not arrive with a shouted argument or a dramatic revelation, but rather it was served alongside a decadent lemon tart from a boutique French bakery in Shaker Heights that I knew for a fact cost $85 plus tax. The air in the dining room, previously heavy with the scent of roasted lamb, was now thick with the cloying, sweet aroma of Madagascar vanilla bean and the sharp, acidic sting of pure, unadulterated disrespect. Victoria reached into her Saint Laurent envelope clutch, her fingers, manicured in a shade of soft petal pink, plucking out a plastic card with a practiced, predatory grace. She slid a $50 Walmart gift card across the polished mahogany table, the cheap blue plastic scraping against the wood with a sound that felt louder than a gunshot in the sudden silence of the room. "This is for your job interviews, honey, because you really cannot keep showing up to professional settings wearing those surplus store rags," she said, her laughter trilling like a silver bell that masked a serrated edge. I stared at the card, then at the $85 dessert that sat mockingly on a gold-rimmed Bernardod porcelain plate, and the sheer mathematical insult of it nearly made my vision blur with a cold, tactical rage. The worst part of the exchange was not Victoria's rehearsed cruelty, but the deafening silence that followed it from the two people who should have been my shield. My father, Jerry, a man who had spent 40 years building a legacy in corporate law and who had once looked me in the eye when I was 18 to tell me I would live to regret enlisting, refused to even look up from his cup of Kona coffee. He stared into the dark liquid as if the answers to his daughter's perceived failures were written in the grounds at the bottom of the ceramic mug. He didn't reprimand her, he didn't slide the card back, and he didn't acknowledge that his youngest daughter was currently serving as a senior tactical analyst with a security clearance that would make his head spin. My mother was equally preoccupied, carefully adjusting the placement of a sterling silver dessert fork, her silence a tacit endorsement of Victoria's condescension. To them, I was still the rebellious girl who ran off to play in the dirt while my siblings stayed home to build real empires of stone and glass. They saw the gift card as an act of charity, a necessary intervention for a sister who had clearly lost her way in the labyrinth of military service. I looked at the gift card again, thinking about the fact that my daily commute to the Pentagon often involved overseeing assets worth more than this entire house and the 4 luxury vehicles parked in its heated garage. I thought about the bronze star tucked away in my duffel bag, a medal earned in a valley where the only thing that mattered was the person to your left and the mission in front of you, a world where a $50 plastic card held zero value compared to loyalty and grit. The humiliation was a physical sensation, a tightening in my throat that I forced down with the same discipline I used during high-stress briefings with Joint Chiefs. Victoria was smiling, a self-satisfied curve of her lips that suggested she felt she had performed a great act of sisterly devotion, while Samuel continued to check his Breitling as if my life was a scheduled appointment he was eager to conclude. The realization that I was utterly alone in this room of my own kin was more isolating than any midnight watch in a remote outpost. I realized then that they didn't just misunderstand my life. They were actively invested in the version of me that was small, broken, and dependent on their scraps. I sat there in my $40 Target jeans, surrounded by thousands of dollars in designer labels and centuries of family history, feeling the final threads of my obligation to this table snap under the weight of their profound, expensive ignorance. I retreated from the suffocating warmth of the house into the biting 38-degree Ohio night, the gravel of the driveway crunching under my tactical boots with a sound that felt like the only honest thing I had heard all evening. I climbed into the driver's seat of my 2019 magnetic metallic Ford F-150, a vehicle that had seen me through cross-country PCS moves and late-night commutes to the Pentagon, and I sat there in the darkness as the EcoBoost engine emitted a rhythmic ticking sound while it cooled. The interior smelled of old coffee and the faint, lingering scent of the CLP gun oil I used to maintain my sidearm, a stark contrast to the cloying vanilla and expensive perfumes that saturated the air inside the $4.2 million Colonial behind me. I reached into the center console and pulled out a battered Moleskine notebook, the kind I had used to scribble coordinates and sit-reps in the back of a bouncing Humvee, and I flipped to a fresh page under the dim glow of the map light. With a steady hand, I drew a single, uncompromising line down the center of the paper, labeling the left column family loyalty and the right column reality. I stared at the page for a long time, the pen hovering over the paper as I waited for a single memory or a shred of evidence to populate the left side, but the family loyalty column remained a haunting, pristine white void. On the right side, under reality, the facts began to pour out with a clinical precision that reflected my years of intelligence training. I thought about my $145,000 government salary, a figure that placed me well above the national average and allowed me to live comfortably in the high-cost-of-living Northern Virginia area without ever needing a handout. I thought about the Veteran Support Foundation I had co-founded, an organization that currently managed over $3.2 million in assets and had provided housing for over 200 former service members in the last fiscal year alone. I thought about the Bronze Star, the tactical analyst commendations, and the respect I commanded in rooms filled with generals and cabinet members who valued my intellect and my courage above all else. None of these achievements meant a single thing to Victoria or Samuel because they had consciously and maliciously chosen to see me as a failure, a broken grunt who was only useful as a target for their performative superiority. The realization hit me with the force of a kinetic strike. My silence over the years, my decision to be the quiet soldier who didn't brag about missions or bank accounts, had been misinterpreted as a lack of substance rather than a presence of character. I had allowed them to craft a narrative where I was a charity case because I didn't care for their designer labels or their shallow social posturing, but tonight that $50 Walmart gift card had been the final breach of the perimeter. I looked at the dark windows of the house, seeing the flickering light of the television in the living room where my father was likely watching the financial news, completely unaware that his youngest daughter could buy and sell his boutique law firm if she truly put her mind to it. I realized that family is not just a shared bloodline or a seat at a holiday table. It is supposed to be a foundation of mutual respect, and in this house, that foundation had long since crumbled into dust and ego. I closed the notebook with a snap, the sound echoing in the quiet cabin of the truck, and I felt a cold, tactical resolve settle over me that was far more dangerous than any anger I had shown before. It was time to stop playing the role of the humble, struggling veteran and start acting like the high-level strategist I actually was, because if they wanted to treat our relationship like a battlefield, they were about to find out exactly why you never underestimate the person who spent a decade mastering the art of the long game. I shifted the truck into gear, the backup camera illuminating the expensive landscaping in high definition as I prepared to execute a new plan, one that would force them to see the reality they had worked so hard to ignore. The silence of the Ohio night was broken only by the low hum of my laptop and the distant rhythmic chirping of a cricket somewhere in the meticulously manicured bushes outside. But inside the cab of my Ford F-150, the atmosphere was one of cold, tactical preparation. I didn't reach out to a lawyer or a therapist to process the insult of that $50 gift card. Instead, I opened my encrypted messaging app and called Marcus, my lead auditor and a man who had spent a decade deconstructing complex financial webs for the Treasury Department before joining my foundation. From 2 in the morning until 4:30 a.m., while the rest of the Shaker Heights elite slept in their high thread count sheets, we sat in a virtual war room, meticulously dissecting the 4-page family care plan that Victoria had drafted with such patronizing arrogance. Marcus whistled through the phone as he looked at the clauses she had inserted, terms that essentially treated me like a legal ward of the state, suggesting I hand over my power of attorney to Samuel in exchange for a monthly stipend of $2,000 and a room in their basement. It was a document designed to strip me of my agency under the guise of familial concern, and as I listened to Marcus detail the predatory nature of her legal language, I felt the last lingering threads of my sisterly affection dissolve into a hard, crystalline resolve. I reached into my glove box and retrieved my encrypted RSA Secure ID hardware tokens, the small digital displays flickering to life as I authorized access to my private investment accounts and the master ledgers of the Valor House Foundation. With the portable high-speed inkjet printer I kept in my mobile office kit, I began to generate a paper trail that would serve as my ammunition for the coming confrontation, starting with 24 months of bank statements that showed a consistent, 6-figure government salary and quarterly dividends from a diversified portfolio that Victoria's public relations firm couldn't touch on its best day. Each page that slid out of the printer felt like a calculated strike against the narrative of the broke grunt they had so carefully constructed over the last decade. I printed the scanned deed to the $1.1 million brick and limestone property in Alexandria that I had quietly purchased for the foundation last spring, a facility that now housed 12 veterans and operated on a budget that was fully funded through the end of the next fiscal year. I added the audited financial reports, each page stamped with the seal of a top-tier accounting firm, proving that my $3.2 million foundation wasn't just a hobby but a highly efficient, transparent machine of social change. The final document I pulled was my most recent federal tax return, a black-and-white testament to a reality they were entirely unprepared to face, and I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as I organized the papers by date and relevance. I tucked every single sheet into a heavy midnight black leather Toomey portfolio, the kind of professional accessory that screamed executive authority rather than military surplus. I felt like I was preparing a classified briefing for a 4-star general, making sure every contingency was covered and every potential counterargument was neutralized by hard, cold data. The clock on the truck's dashboard turned to 4:45 a.m., and the first hint of a gray, cold dawn began to bleed over the horizon, illuminating the frost on the windshield of Victoria's Range Rover parked nearby. I sat there for a moment, my hand resting on the leather portfolio, realizing that for years I had protected them from the truth of my success because I didn't want to make them feel small. But that era of self-censorship was officially over. They wanted to play a game of status and financial dominance in a house built on hollow prestige, but they were about to find out that the sister they looked down upon had spent her entire adult life mastering the art of the long-range strike. I wasn't just Jess the soldier anymore. I was the most dangerous person at their breakfast table, and I had the documentation to prove that while they were busy polishing their marble islands, I had been busy building a legacy they could never hope to understand. 2 weeks after the insult of the gift card, the air in Shaker Heights turned crisp, but the atmosphere inside Victoria's 5,000-square-foot suburban estate was stiflingly humid with the scent of performative virtue and high-end catering. She had organized what she called a care strategy gala, an event that was ostensibly about planning our parents' golden years but was actually a stage for her to play the role of the saintly, successful daughter to an audience of 45 local power players, including municipal judges and members of Samuel's surgical board. The catering staff, dressed in crisp white coats, circulated with silver trays of Wagyu beef crostini and smoked salmon blinis that I knew had cost her exactly $4,800 from a top-tier firm in Cleveland. Victoria was in her absolute element, gliding through the room in a navy silk Roland Mouret sheath dress that clung to her ego as much as her frame, holding a glass of Veuve Clicquot while she whispered loudly enough for the influential guests to hear about the heavy burden of managing her struggling parents and her aimless, traumatized sister. She was painting a masterpiece of familial tragedy where she was the only hero, and the guests nodded with practiced sympathy, their expensive jewelry catching the light of the three-tier baccarat chandelier. I chose that exact moment to make my entrance, not through the service door or the kitchen as they expected, but through the main foyer with the measured rhythmic pace of a woman who had marched on grounds that demanded respect. I wasn't wearing the Target jeans or the scuffed boots they used to define my worth. I was wearing my army dress blues, tailored to a razor-edge precision that emphasized the strength in my shoulders and the absolute straightness of a spine tempered by years of tactical command. My shoes were polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the expensive hardwood floors, and the bronze star on my chest caught the light with a dull, authoritative glow that outshone every piece of designer jewelry in that room. The chatter in the grand foyer died down as if someone had cut the power to the speakers, the judges and surgeons turning their heads to see a senior tactical analyst who looked less like a charity case and more like a commander of the forces that protected their very right to host such a vapid gathering. I kept my back as straight as a bayonet, my gaze fixed forward with a level of intensity that made the nearest board member instinctively take a half step back to clear my path. Victoria froze mid-sentence, her glass of champagne tilting dangerously as she took in the sight of the medals, the stripes and the sheer, unyielding aura of authority I brought into her carefully curated sanctuary of pretension. She had spent a decade trying to bury my service under a pile of Loro Piana sweaters and condescending remarks, but standing there in the center of her ballroom, I was a living, breathing contradiction to every lie she had told the people in this room. Samuel, standing by the fireplace with a glass of 18-year-old Macallan, looked as though he had just witnessed a surgical complication he couldn't bill his way out of, his face pale against the flickering amber light. I didn't say a word as I walked toward the center of the room, the heavy black Toomey portfolio tucked firmly under my arm like a weapon of war. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the sudden sharp scent of their mounting panic because they knew that the quiet soldier had finally stopped retreating. I wasn't there to eat their $4,800 food or listen to their hollow toasts. I was there to conduct a final briefing, and for the first time in their lives, they were going to be forced to listen to a reality that no amount of marble or silk could ever hide. The public execution did not begin with a shout but with the rhythmic, calculated clinking of a sterling silver spoon against a Waterford crystal flute as Victoria stood to deliver her final, crushing blow. The room, filled with the scent of $4,800 worth of catering and the expensive colognes of Shaker Heights elite, fell into a hush that felt like a vacuum. Victoria leaned into the microphone, her smile as sharp and artificial as the diamonds at her throat, and announced that after much deliberation, the family had decided that Jess would contribute a modest 10% of our parents' care costs as she was, in Victoria's words, financially limited by her career choices. A ripple of patronizing pity moved through the crowd of 45 guests, including the municipal judges and Samuel's surgical colleagues, who looked at my dress blues as if they were a costume worn by a beggar at a masquerade. I didn't flinch and I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I stood up with the steady, predatory grace of a soldier who had spent a decade watching targets walk into a kill zone, and I opened my midnight black Toomey portfolio with a deliberate, metallic snap. Actually, Victoria, since we are being so transparent about the family's future in front of our distinguished neighbors, let us look at the real numbers and the legal reality of the situation, I said, my voice projecting with the authority of a tactical commander debriefing the Joint Chiefs. I walked toward the nearest table of local dignitaries and began handing out high-resolution, audited copies of a document Victoria never intended for the light of day, the secret referral kickback agreement she had signed with the director of the Heritage Oaks Assisted Living Facility. The paper trail, which my auditor Marcus and I had verified through 3 separate encrypted bank tokens, clearly showed that Victoria had negotiated a scheme to pocket $1,500 every single month from our parents' care fund as a finder's fee for their placement. The room went from a respectful hush to a graveyard silence as the local judges began to scan the signature lines, their professional eyes immediately identifying the blatant ethical and potentially criminal implications of a daughter skimming off the top of her own parents' retirement. I watched the color drain from Victoria's face, leaving her Loro Piana draped frame looking like a ghost in her own 5,000-square-foot sanctuary, while Samuel sat frozen, his $15,000 Breitling Navitimer glinting mockingly in the light of the baccarat chandelier. You spoke of my financial limitations, Victoria. But perhaps you were projecting your own desperate need for liquidity after that $2.4 million quarter you bragged about turned out to be mostly unrealized debt, I continued, my tone as cold and surgical as the scalpel Samuel used in his operating theater. I then placed the audited financial reports of my $3.2 million Veteran Support Foundation on the main podium, alongside a certified bank statement showing a liquidity that dwarfed the combined annual salaries of everyone sitting at the head table. I explained to the stunned audience that I had already purchased a $1.1 million property in Alexandria for veteran housing and that I would be assuming full financial and legal responsibility for our parents, effective immediately without the need for kickbacks, gift cards, or the patronizing charity of siblings who valued marble islands over blood. The air in the room was no longer thick with the scent of vanilla and luxury. It was heavy with the smell of a reputation being dismantled in real time, bone by bone, before the very people whose respect Victoria had spent a lifetime purchasing. I looked my sister in the eye, seeing the frantic calculation behind her pupils as she realized that the quiet soldier she had spent 20 years belittling was the only person in the room who actually understood the definition of honor. I didn't need to yell because the truth, backed by 16 pages of audited evidence and a decade of tactical discipline, was more devastating than any physical strike. I stood there in the center of her grand hall, my medals polished and my back straight as a bayonet, watching as the elite of Ohio began to whisper and pull away from her, realizing that the saintly daughter was nothing more than a common grifter in a designer dress. The mission was complete, the perimeter was secured, and for the first time in 34 years, the silence in my family's house was finally one of respect rather than repression. The room was so quiet that the hum of the climate control system sounded like a jet engine, and I didn't let the tension break as I lifted the next document from my black leather portfolio, my voice steady and cold as a winter morning in the Hindu Kush. I continued to read directly from my certified federal tax returns, the numbers cutting through the air like a precision strike against the fragile glass ego Victoria had spent decades constructing. Last year, my private tactical consulting firm, which I run alongside my duties at the Pentagon, netted a personal profit of $210,000, I announced, and my foundation, the one Victoria so mockingly referred to as a hobby during our last family dinner, was recently awarded a $1.2 million federal grant for its exemplary work in veteran transition services. I saw a municipal judge in the front row lean forward, his eyes narrowing as he realized that the woman in the dress blues wasn't just a soldier, but a high-level executive operating in a sphere of influence far beyond this suburban cul-de-sac. I turned my gaze toward Samuel, whose knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany mantel, his $15,000 Breitling reflecting the flicker of the fireplace like a frantic distress signal. And Samuel, since we are discussing financial contributions to our parents' future, let us be entirely honest about your 20% stake in their care, I said, my words punctuated by a silence so heavy it felt physical. Your generous contribution is actually being paid out of the $50,000 personal loan I gave you 3 years ago when your private practice was struggling with malpractice insurance premiums. A loan that you conveniently stopped acknowledging and have never repaid a single cent of. The sound of a reedal crystal flute hitting the white oak hardwood floor was like a gunshot, the glass shattering into 1,000 glittering shards near the feet of a surgical board member who looked at Samuel with a mixture of shock and professional re-evaluation. The scent of spilled vintage champagne rose from the floor, sharp and yeasty, mixing with the metallic tang of the cold air I had brought in with me from the driveway. Samuel's face transitioned from a pale mask of shock to a deep, bruised purple, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping as he realized I had just dismantled his reputation as the family's financial rock in front of his peers. Victoria tried to step forward, her $1,200 Loro Piana sweater suddenly looking like a cheap shroud, but she found no support from the guests who were now actively distancing themselves from the blast radius of her exposed lies. I wasn't just reading numbers. I was performing a forensic audit of their characters, peeling back the layers of designer labels and inherited prestige to reveal the hollow, desperate people underneath. My parents sat in the center of the room, looking at their eldest children as if they were strangers, the $85 lemon tart from earlier that week surely tasting like ash in their memories compared to the raw, expensive truth I was laying out on the table. I stood there in my dress blues, the weight of my bronze star feeling lighter now that the burden of their secrets had been transferred back to them, and I realized that the $50 Walmart gift card Victoria had slid across the table was the most expensive mistake she had ever made. I had spent my career analyzing threats and predicting movements on a global scale, and they had honestly believed they could outmaneuver me with a few snide remarks and a fraudulent care plan. The shattered crystal on the floor was a perfect metaphor for the family dynamic they had fought so hard to maintain. A beautiful, transparent lie that was now broken beyond any hope of repair. I closed my portfolio with a definitive leather-bound thud that echoed through the 5,000 square feet of Victoria's crumbling empire, and for the first time in 34 years, I didn't feel like the outsider. I felt like the only person in the room who truly knew the value of a foundation built on something stronger than marble. The silence that followed my revelation was not merely a lack of sound but a heavy, pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of Victoria's vaulted great room, leaving the 45 guests frozen like statues in a gallery of high-end vanity. I turned my back on my siblings, the metals on my chest clicking softly with the movement, and looked directly at my parents, Jerry and Martha, who sat huddled together on a $6,000 velvet sofa that suddenly looked like a life raft in a rising tide of scandal. I did not raise my voice, but I ensured every syllable carried the weight of a tactical order as I informed them that the era of being treated like pawns in Victoria's social games was officially over. I have already purchased a 3-bedroom, fully ADA-compliant bungalow in Alexandria, Virginia, located less than 10 minutes from my own home and staffed with 24/7 professional nursing care that has been paid in full for the next 5 years through my private trust, I said, watching as my father's eyes finally met mine with a mixture of profound shock and a dawning, heartbreaking sense of relief. I told them clearly that they were moving the following Tuesday, and that they did not owe Victoria a single percentage of their retirement fund or Samuel a dime of their dignity, because the daughter they had spent decades overlooking was the only one who had actually built a fortress for their protection. The transformation in Victoria was instantaneous and visceral, her elegant Loro Piana-draped facade crumbling into something ugly and primal as her face shifted from a deathly, panicked pale to a blotchy, hysterical red that clashed violently with her designer lipstick. She looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's, but she found no sanctuary among her power couple friends or the municipal judges she had worked so hard to impress. Instead, she saw them leaning away from her, their whispers filling the gaps in the conversation like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a grave. The surgical board members were already checking their watches and making subtle gestures toward the foyer, their professional respect for Samuel evaporating in real time as they realized the top doctor they had come to celebrate was actually a man who lived on unearned loans from his younger sister. The scent of the $4,800 catering was now completely overtaken by the sharp metallic smell of high-stakes failure and the heavy floral musk of the lilies that decorated the mantel, which now looked more like funeral arrangements for Victoria's social standing. I stood my ground in the center of the hardwood floor, the shards of the shattered crystal flute glittering around my boots like diamonds in the dirt, and I felt a sense of clarity that was more intoxicating than any vintage Cabernet. My mother reached out, her hand trembling as she brushed the fabric of my dress blue sleeve, finally seeing the stripes and the medals not as a rejection of the family business but as the very things that had saved them from a life of quiet, subsidized misery in a sterile assisted living facility. Victoria tried to speak, her mouth opening to let out a jagged, high-pitched protest about the house being hers and the gala being her triumph, but the words died in her throat as she caught the cold, predatory gaze of the local judge she had been trying to court for a public relations contract. The mission was no longer about defending my own honor. It was about the extraction of the two people who had raised us, moving them from an environment of parasitic manipulation to a place of genuine safety and respect. As the first of the guests began to slip toward the exit without even offering a polite goodbye to their host, I realized that the $50 Walmart gift card had truly been the catalyst for a total regime change. And for the first time in 34 years, the power in this family was no longer measured by the price of a marble island, but by the strength of the person willing to hold the line when the truth finally came home. The fallout from that evening radiated through the Shaker Heights social circuit like a controlled demolition, precise and irreversible, leaving Victoria's carefully curated reputation as a premier public relations strategist in a state of absolute structural failure. Within 72 hours of the gala, the high-resolution copies of the Heritage Oaks kickback agreement had found their way into the hands of the very local judges and bar association members she had spent thousands of dollars to impress with her Wagyu crostini and vintage champagne. The once constant hum of her social calendar was replaced by a deafening silence from the country club elite, And the record-breaking $2.4 million quarter she had bragged about became a hollow memory as her firm's primary clients began to quietly terminate their contracts to avoid being associated with a woman who skimmed $1,500 a month from her own parents' care fund. Victoria, once so proud of her $1,200 Loro Piana sweaters and her marble island, was forced to watch as the power she had bought with arrogance and manipulation dissolved in the light of a truth she never thought I was smart enough to expose. Samuel's descent into reality was equally visceral and devoid of the surgical precision he usually prided himself on, as the pressure of the $50,000 debt he had conveniently forgotten finally came due with the added weight of years of accumulated interest. To begin servicing the financial hole he had dug for himself, he was forced to sell his 2022 Gentian blue Porsche 911 Carrera, a car that had been the primary symbol of his status in the Cleveland Clinic parking garage, replacing it with a used, utilitarian sedan that offered no prestige to match his Tag Heuer Carrera watch. The surgical board members who had witnessed the shattered crystal on Victoria's floor began to look at him not as a titan of medicine, but as a man whose private life was a series of unmanaged liabilities and ethical shortcuts. He no longer tapped his fingers on the marble with the authority of a seven-figure neurosurgeon. Instead, he sat in hushed meetings with accountants, finally forced to acknowledge that the broke grunt he had pitted was actually the only reason his private practice hadn't collapsed under the weight of his own vanity 3 years ago. The most profound shift, however, occurred within the quiet walls of the ADA-compliant bungalow in Alexandria, where the air smelled of fresh cedar and real stability rather than the heavy perfumes of a Shaker Heights estate. My parents, Jerry and Martha, spent their first week in the sun-drenched living room watching the Potomac River instead of staring at the walls of a boutique nursing home, finally seeing their youngest daughter for the tactical analyst and loyal protector she had always been. My father, the man who once told me I would regret enlisting, sat with me on the porch one evening and looked at the bronze star I had finally taken out of my duffel bag, his eyes welling with a deep, silent realization that he had nearly traded his dignity for a daughter who viewed him as a referral fee. They finally saw that the tactical boots and the Target jeans were the uniform of a person who didn't need a trophy or a marble island to define her worth, because her value was measured in the lives she secured and the promises she kept. I stood in the doorway of their new home, the 2019 Ford F-150 parked in the driveway and my black Toomey portfolio finally tucked away, feeling a sense of peace that no amount of military commendation could ever provide. I had spent a decade leading men through the most dangerous valleys on earth, but the mission of reclaiming my family's honor from the clutches of my own siblings had been the most complex operation of my career. Victoria and Samuel were left with their designer labels and their crumbling empires, while I held the only currency that truly mattered in the end, the unshakable knowledge that I had stood my ground, protected my own, and proved that a soldier's loyalty is a force that no amount of inherited wealth can ever buy or break. Family isn't about the blood that makes you related, but about who stays in the foxhole with you when the truth starts falling like shrapnel. And as the sun set over the Virginia skyline, I knew the mission was finally, irrevocably complete. The final transition of my parents into their new life in Alexandria was executed with the same logistical precision I had once used to move armored columns through the dusty corridors of Kandahar, leaving behind the toxic echoes of Shaker Heights for a reality built on genuine security. The financial ledger for this operation was absolute and unyielding, reflecting a total investment of $840,000 for the sun-drenched single-story property that sat nestled near the Potomac, plus an additional $12,000 for the professional white-glove relocation services that handled every piece of my parents' history with the respect they deserved. The most significant figure on that balance sheet, however, was the $0 I allocated for the opinions, protests, or manufactured grievances of my siblings, who had spent their entire lives treating our parents' future like a line item in their own vanity projects. I stood in the center of the new living room, the air smelling of fresh unscented paint and the faint, comforting aroma of the specialized medical-grade air filtration system I had installed to protect my father's aging lungs, and I felt the weight of decades of familial gaslighting finally lift off my shoulders. The silence of my new reality was briefly interrupted by the frantic vibration of my encrypted work phone, a digital scream from a world I was no longer interested in inhabiting, as Victoria sent a 14-paragraph manifesto that was a masterclass in narcissistic projection and psychological desperation. She used every inch of that digital space to blame me for ruining the family dynamic, accusing me of being a cold-blooded tactician who had dismantled a beautiful legacy for the sake of a personal vendetta, all while ignoring the $1,500 a month kickback agreement she had signed in cold blood. I didn't engage with her histrionics, and I didn't offer her the emotional reaction she was clearly hunting for to validate her own victimhood. Instead, I waited until she reached her final rambling conclusion before I sent a single devastatingly quiet reply. I attached a solitary PDF file, a formal cease and desist order drafted by the highest-tier estate attorneys in Northern Virginia, explicitly forbidding her or Samuel from contacting our parents regarding financial matters, estate planning, or any further attempts at legal guardianship. I watched the status of the message change to read, and then I systematically blocked her number, Samuel's number, and every secondary social media account they used to monitor the life they thought they controlled. There was no dramatic goodbye and no final exchange of insults, just the clean, surgical severing of a bond that had become parasitic, a tactical retreat from a battlefield where the only way to win was to stop playing the game entirely. I walked out onto the back deck of the Alexandria bungalow, watching my mother arrange her favorite porcelain birds on a shelf by the window, her face free of the tension that had defined her existence for the last 5 years under Victoria's thumb. The $65,000 administrative job Samuel had patronizingly offered me seemed like a joke from a different lifetime as I checked my foundation's latest impact report, knowing that the $1.2 million federal grant was already being deployed to save lives that actually mattered. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the lawn where a private duty nurse was quietly checking my father's vitals with a level of care that no boutique kickback scheme could ever provide. I adjusted my watch, the scratched Garmin Tactics Delta that had seen me through the worst of the world, and realized that my mission to protect my parents had been the most successful operation of my 34 years. Victoria and Samuel could keep their $1,200 sweaters, their $15,000 watches, and the hollow, echoing silence of their 5,000-square-foot estates, but they no longer had the power to trade our parents' dignity for a social promotion. I had moved my family into the light, and as I breathed in the humid, honest air of the Virginia evening, I knew that the quiet soldier had finally won the only war that truly mattered. Family is not defined by the blood you share but by the sanctuary you are willing to build for those who truly need it, and in this house the perimeter was finally, eternally secure. The silence of my home office in Northern Virginia is a heavy, sacred thing, a stark and deliberate departure from the chaotic hum of the Pentagon or the sharp, judgmental air of Shaker Heights. I sit here at my desk, a solid slab of reclaimed walnut that holds the weight of my encrypted laptop and the heavy Toomey portfolio, and my eyes drift to the silver-framed photograph that sits precisely at a 45-degree angle near my monitors. It is a grainy, sun-bleached image of my unit in Afghanistan, taken during a rare moment of respite in a valley that smelled of dust, diesel, and the constant metallic tang of impending adrenaline. In the photo, we are covered in the fine, pale silt of the desert, our uniforms mismatched and our faces lined with a fatigue that no amount of Loro Piana cashmere could ever soothe or hide. My team, men and women who never asked about my quarterly earnings or the brand of my watch, stand with their arms draped over each other's shoulders, bound by a loyalty that was forged in the heat of IED-laden valleys and midnight extractions. Looking at their eyes, I am reminded that true family is not something you inherit by the sheer accident of birth or find at a polished marble dinner table where your sacrifices are treated like social inconveniences and your worth is measured in gift cards. The realization is as sharp as a bayonet. True family is found in the trenches, among the people who would bleed for you without ever demanding a trophy for their service or a kickback from your care fund. My sister Victoria and my brother Samuel spent 30 years trying to make me feel small, using their $1,200 sweaters and $15,000 Breitlings as armor against a reality they were too cowardly to face. They viewed my Bronze Star as a participation trophy because they could not comprehend a world where value is derived from character rather than net worth. But as I sit in the quiet of my own success, their opinions feel like distant, harmless echoes. I have built a fortress for my parents, a $1.1 million sanctuary of dignity and professional care, and I have done it with the cold, tactical efficiency that my siblings once mocked as aimless. I didn't need their approval to secure the perimeter of my life, and I certainly didn't need their permission to become the woman who now oversees millions in veteran assets while they struggle to maintain the facade of their crumbling suburban empires. I reach out and trace the edge of the frame, my fingers brushing against the glass over the faces of my brothers and sisters in arms, the only people who truly know the weight of the silence I now enjoy. The 38-degree Ohio nights and the $85 lemon tarts are part of a history I have finally archived, replaced by a deep, internal peace that comes from knowing exactly who I am when the designer labels are stripped away. I am Jessica, a senior tactical analyst, a Bronze Star recipient, and the only daughter who stayed in the foxhole when the truth started falling like shrapnel. As the soft glow of my desk lamp illuminates the room, I realize that the most important mission of my life wasn't conducted in Bakwa or at the Pentagon, but right there in that Shaker Heights kitchen when I decided to stop being the quiet soldier. I have traded their hollow prestige for a reality built on honor, grit, and the unshakable knowledge that I am the architect of my own legacy. The mission is officially closed, the survivors are safe, and for the first time in my 34 years I am finally truly home.